What is in agreement with myself, insofar as I consider myself as an individual of the essential world, is pleasant, but harmonizes with me, as determined by the whole of the sensual world, is beautiful. What is in agreement with me, as part of the intellectual world, is good. Firstly, with me as an individual, and secondly, as a part of the whole. Immanuel Kant. As I explained in my previous lecture on Kant's whole project of a critique of reason, he asked the question, how are synthetic judgments, that is, judgments that don't just analyze and further explain and further clarify what we already know, but rather judgments that expand our knowledge, judgments through which we gain new knowledge. How are synthetic judgments a priori, that is, judgments that are not based on experience but that come from pure reason, how are such synthetic judgments a priori possible? And as I also explained, Kant divides the human mind or psyche into three parts: the faculty of cognition, the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, and finally the desiring faculty. And therefore, there are three kinds of judgments: logical, aesthetical, and practical judgments. And therefore, this general question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible, can be divided into three sub-questions. And I spent the last about 4 months talking about what Kant has to say about the faculty of cognition and about the question how logical, that is, judgments that deal with truth or falsehood, how logical synthetic judgments a priori are possible. And the result was that we can make synthetic judgments a priori, that as such, as judgments a priori don't come from experience, but that are still about experience, about possible experience. So we can say a priori, we can say before making experience how that experience will be like in general terms, what form, generally speaking, that experience will have. But what we cannot do is move completely beyond experience with our cognition. What we cannot do is making synthetic judgments a priori about things that are completely supersensual, like the soul and whether it's immortal or not, like whether I'm free, like whether there's a God. This we cannot know one way or the other. Now I'm finished with that, and I want to turn to the second faculty of our mind, that is the feeling of pleasure and displeasure. And here we have aesthetical judgments. So those are the judgments that are not concerned with what is the case in the world, but rather with how we are feeling, whether we are feeling good or bad. And here too, Kant says we can make synthetic judgments a priori, that is, judgments mainly about the beautiful and also about the sublime. And here too, his question is, how is that possible? And he asks that in his critique of the power of judgment, which chronologically, out of his three main works, his three critiques, was written last. But I'm dealing with it here second, because Kant himself says that the feeling of pleasure and displeasure is sort of the bridge between the faculty of cognition and the desiring faculty. And he also says that those other two, on them you can build a science. That is theoretical philosophy and practical philosophy. The philosophy of being, what is the case, and the philosophy of freedom. What should we do? How should we act with our freedom? I talked about this in my lecture on what is philosophy to Kant. He says that this middle faculty, this feeling of pleasure and displeasure, This is more a subject for anthropology, for empirical psychology, not for metaphysical philosophy. And it is a subject on which you can't build a field of philosophy. You can't build a proper positive science on it, Kant says, but you can still criticize it with reason. You can still try to understand how it works and what limits it has. And that is what I want to talk about for the next few lectures. And I want to start in this lecture with talking in general about what feeling means to Kant. What is the feeling of pleasure and displeasure? And well, first off, we should distinguish between feelings and sensations. And I already talked about this a little in my lecture on sensuality and on time and space as forms of viewing. To Kant, both the feeling and the sensation are subjective representations. So remember, representation is, in the language of 18th century philosophy, it is sort of the general term for any sort of content of our mind, conscious or not. So it could be a thought, it could be a viewing, it could be a desire, it could be a feeling. They are all representations. Now, sensations and feelings, they are both subjective representations. So they are in me, not really in an object. But there is a difference between them, and that difference to Kant is that the sensation, while subjective, still relates to an object and still can be the grounds for learning something about that object. So sensations would be things like red or salty, or the sound of something, like the sound of someone's voice or whatever. Those would be sensations. And while they are subjective, and while, of course, as physics also teaches us, in a way, the object itself is not really red, I just perceive it as being red because of the way it reflects the light. And it is really quite important to Kant that you cannot learn anything about, well, anything from a feeling directly. Not even about yourself. Of course, you could make the feeling itself an object. Like, you could reflect about the feeling. So if you are sad, you could reflect about that sadness and ask why you are sad. But then it is not the sadness itself which is teaching you something. It is the objectifying of your sadness and the reflecting about your sadness. But simply by the fact that you are sad, you don't learn anything about the world, nor do you learn anything about yourself. While, on the other hand, by the fact that you see something red or that you taste saltiness, you do learn something about an object. You learn there is something red in front of my eyes, or there is something salty in my mouth. And as I talked about before in a previous lecture, unfortunately, even though this really should be a pretty basic statement and not a very controversial or very deeply philosophical statement, unfortunately, it really isn't the case that most people are aware of this. Most people do seem to think that feelings teach them something about reality. They will say, I feel that this or that is the case. So go with something like sympathy. They will say, oh, I have a good feeling about that person, or they will say, oh, I dislike that person. That person doesn't give me a good vibe or whatever. and they will think that this tells them something about that person. Well, it doesn't. Maybe you don't take a liking to that person because that person actually is an asshole. Yeah, could be. But you can't just make that conclusion. It could also be that you have a feeling of dislike towards that person, not because there's anything wrong with that person, but quite the contrary, because there's something wrong with you. Maybe that person is the best person who ever lived, and maybe that's exactly the reason you hate him, because you are the asshole. I mean, that's what the Bible tells us, for example, happened to Jesus, right? He wasn't crucified because he was such a bad guy, but quite the opposite. He was crucified because those who crucified him were the bad guys. Bad people do tend to instinctively hate good people. Or likewise, when people are crushing or when people are in love, they tend to believe that because they are crushing on someone, that someone must be a great person. But again, that's not the case. Could be, but maybe you actually have very bad taste. Maybe you actually fall in love with people not because they are great people, but once again, quite the opposite. Maybe that's a horrible person, and you being so infatuated just distorts your view of that person. And unfortunately, we now live in an age where these sorts of feelings are not just taken as the grounds for a cognition, for actual knowledge in private life, but even in politics. People make politics based on such feelings. Like the right will say, this is something that here in Germany you hear quite a lot. I feel like a stranger in my own country. And then they will conclude, therefore, this proves that my country is overrun by strange people and my country's culture is being destroyed, when it really doesn't prove that. It really only says that you feel that way. Maybe you are wrong to feel that way. And maybe you should just stop being so sensitive. Maybe you should just stop being a little bitch. I mean, it's quite funny if you think about it, that the right-wingers are sort of obsessed with their manliness and with stoicism, but they don't act like stoics at all. Rather, they are so sensitive, they are getting triggered by someone on the street next to them not speaking German but Turkish or whatever. That's not exactly stoic. That's, once again, being a little bitch. But, of course, the left is no better. I mean, the left and the whole vogue or political correct morality is all about sensitivities. It is all about being triggered, or rather about demanding that people don't do whatever could trigger others. And here too, you have people arguing based on feelings. So someone will say this or that word or behavior or whatever, this feels like an attack to people, like this feels racist to black people, or this feels misogynist to women or whatever. Therefore it is racist, therefore it is misogynist, therefore you mustn't do it. And here too, the aufklärt answer would be maybe, maybe not. Just because someone feels that something is racist, just because it makes him feel bad, doesn't mean that it actually is bad and should be stopped. It could also be something completely harmless, and it could also be that that person is just overreacting. Mere feelings don't prove or disprove anything. You have to reflect. And as soon as you reflect, you can be questioned. As soon as you reflect, you have to be ready to enter a discussion and to exchange arguments. Then you can't just say, no, I have my feelings and you are not the same as me, like you're not a woman or you're not black, you're not gay, whatever, so you don't know how it feels. Yeah, sure, maybe I don't know how it feels, but the point is, how it feels is irrelevant when we are talking about truth. Truth is not determined by the way you feel. So, really, we should take our sensitivities out of politics. Actually, we should take them out of life completely. We should not be overly sensitive and triggered by every little nonsense. I mean, we have real problems. We are in the midst of the sixth great mass extinction. We are in the midst of a climate collapse. We are facing the very destruction of our civilization. Maybe, just maybe, we have bigger problems than whatever happens to triggers the left or the right or whatever. Maybe we have bigger problems than being triggered by pronouns, one way or the other. Being triggered by someone using unusual pronouns, or being triggered by others refusing to use those unusual pronouns you chose. Both is really your private issue and not an issue of public politics. But anyways, what Kant is also saying is that sensations can be neutral. Like, if I see a red or a blue object, that could be neutral to me. Or if I hear a certain sound, like someone talking, that could be a neutral thing to me. The feeling, on the other hand, is always about pleasure or displeasure. So to Kant, there are no feelings that are neither pleasurable or not pleasurable. You can't say I'm sad, but I'm not feeling displeasure, because sadness is a feeling of displeasure. Or you can't say I'm happy, but I'm not feeling pleasure, because happiness is a feeling of pleasure. All feelings, if indeed they are feelings and not sensations, all feelings to Kant are about pleasure or displeasure. And in my lecture on sensuality, I talked about the senses, and I said that to Kant there are 5 organ senses, the classical 5 senses of hearing, seeing, tasting, smelling, and touching. And what Kant is saying is that the further removed those senses are from pleasure and displeasure, the more we can learn through them. So I said in that other lecture that Kant distinguishes between the 3 instructive senses of touching, seeing, and hearing, and the 2, as he calls them, savoring senses of smelling and tasting. And he would say that the first 3, they relate more to the faculty of cognition. So through them we can make experience. While the other 2 relate more closely to the faculty of the feeling of pleasure and displeasure. So we don't learn much through them, we don't experience much through them, but rather we have a pleasure or a displeasure. Kant would say that it's not really possible to taste or smell something without, at least to some small degree, liking or disliking that taste or that smell. So again, the less connection there is between a sensation and feeling, the better can this sensation actually tell me something about the world, the better can it teach me something. I could maybe add to that, to what Kant says, that even those senses of instruction, seeing, touching, hearing, that are less connected to pleasure and displeasure, even here it is the case that if they, or rather the sensations they give us, if those become pleasurable or displeasurable, then they stop really being instructive, right? So through seeing, you can learn something about the world, but only as long as that seeing is not really giving you strong displeasure. The moment you are experiencing displeasure from seeing, like if you are looking into the sun, if you're looking into light that is too bright and your eyes are hurting from it, then you stop really seeing something. You stop really being able through seeing to make an experience, right? The same can be said about whatever you hear. As soon as it becomes painful, like if there's a very loud sound that feels like your ears are exploding, then you can't really hear anymore what's going on. So the sensation, as soon as it turns into a feeling, stops being instructive. It stops being something on which an experience can be based, and rather it just turns into a feeling of pleasure or of displeasure. But what is a feeling of pleasure or displeasure? What does that mean? Kant says it's something quite remarkable, that we cannot just have representations that tell us something about the world, that allow us to make experience. So representations belonging to the faculty of cognition, representations that as such are neutral to us, but rather that we can have representations that we like or dislike. And he says that explaining this is among the hardest things there is to explain, and that there can't really be a proper theory or science of this faculty of the feeling. But what Kant does say is that pleasure means a representation that determines us to sort of embrace and want to keep that representation. While, on the other hand, displeasure would mean a representation that determines us to avoid, to push away that representation, right? So if I have a feeling that feels good, that feels pleasurable, then I want that feeling to continue. That is exactly what feeling pleasure means. It means having a representation that I want to continue. Like if I had a neutral representation, if I'm seeing something that I neither like or dislike, like I'm just looking at the wall, or maybe if I'm thinking of something, like I'm thinking of the number 100, then I have a representation in my mind, but I don't particularly care about that representation continuing or not. I could think of the number 100 for a little longer, or I could start thinking about something else. But if I have a representation that I like, that feels good, then that means I want it to continue. And on the other hand, if I have a representation that I dislike, that doesn't feel good, then that doesn't mean anything else but wanting that representation to end as soon as possible, sort of pushing it away. What is important, however, is in this definition that it really is just about the representation as such. So I want to keep, or I want to get rid of my representation if I feel pleasure or displeasure. It is not necessarily an object. As soon as I wanted to get an object, maybe because it gives me pleasure, or as soon as I wanted to get rid of an object, maybe because it gives me displeasure, then that would be a desire. And desires are not part of this faculty of feeling. They belong to their own faculty, to the desiring faculty. And I will get to this in a few weeks when I start talking about Kant's practical philosophy. So the desire would be a representation that determines me to want an object, or to want an object gun. Like maybe I have a thorn in my side that is causing me pain. That pain is, of course, a feeling of displeasure, and I want that feeling to go away. I want the pain to leave me. But since the pain is caused by this thorn and won't stop as long as the thorn is there, I also want the object to be gone. I want the thorn to be pulled out. And this would be a desire, since it relates to an object. A feeling as such only relates to itself, to the representation I'm having. Of course, a feeling can be the basis for a desire, and very often feelings of pleasure or of displeasure do cause our desires, but still Kant would say that not always is it the case that a feeling is also related to a desire and therefore to an object. Like I could feel sad, I could have a general melancholy or depressed feeling that is not caused by a specific object and therefore won't go away by getting rid of a specific object. And in that case, I would still feel displeasure. Like the sadness would feel bad. And that means I would want this representation to vanish. But I wouldn't necessarily have a desire to change anything in the world outside of me. I wouldn't necessarily have a desire related to an object in some way. So that is what a feeling means to Kant. It is a representation that somehow determines me to want to continue having or to want to stop having that representation. But that is just what philosophy of the time called a name explanation. So basically a definition, explaining what we mean by the name feeling of pleasure or displeasure, but not really explaining what it is, how it works. Well, to Kant, a feeling is really the relationship of a specific representation to the whole of our mind and the forces or the strengths of our mind. Because our mind or our psyche either has the strengths to take up a representation, to embrace a representation, and that would be the feeling of pleasure, or it feels sort of overwhelmed by that representation. It feels like it can't take up that representation and can't make it part of itself and can't fit it into itself. And that would be the feeling of displeasure. You could maybe compare that to the stomach, right? So some things you eat, your stomach can take up and digest and make a part of yourself. In German we have this word, sich etwas einverleiben. And einverleiben literally means to incorporate. So, right, when you eat something, it literally becomes part of your body. Not all of it, of course, but at least parts of it will be digested in your stomach and literally be made part of you. But then you could also eat something which your stomach can't really deal with, which your stomach is not able to incorporate into your body. And in that case, your stomach would probably try to push it out again. You would maybe vomit. And this now could be compared to the feeling, except that here we are not talking about the stomach and we are not talking about food, but rather we are talking about the psyche and we are talking about representations. So there are some representations that the psyche can sort of incorporate into itself. Nietzsche actually in German creates its own word for that. So, as I said, we have this word einverleiben, and Leib is the body, so making part of the body, incorporating. And Nietzsche creates the word einverseelen, and Seele is soul, so making something part of your soul. And that is what's happening. Many representations, like experiences you make, memories you make, they are sort of made part of your soul, part of your psyche. But if you are confronted with a representation which sort of overwhelms your psyche, which can't be einverseelt, so incorporated, then that would be something that causes you a feeling of displeasure. And of course, just like there are people who maybe have a strong stomach, who maybe can stomach more things, and there are other people whose stomach gets upset very easily, who feel sickly very easily, even if they eat something that is only slightly bad. Just like that, you have people with a sort of strong and resilient psyche who can take up lots of representations and are not really bothered by them. And on the other hand, you have people that are very sensitive and very easily triggered. So that constantly experience, even if it's just slight in many cases, but that constantly experience displeasure. And this is something that is only amplified nowadays by our lifestyle and also by the way children are raised. Like, we are creating whole generations of people that are basically not really able to face life and to face the world. And we can very clearly see that in the world. And again, we can very clearly see that in politics, that many people experience at least small displeasures on a daily basis. The smallest things can make them upset or angry or whatever. It can sometimes be the most silly things, acting like a broken nail or someone saying the wrong word when referring to you is the end of the world. And those people often don't realize how easygoing and how delicious life could be if they just approached it in a different manner. Like, they truly don't know that it is absolutely possible to live in happiness or in felicity, that it is possible to go whole days, even whole weeks or whole month, without feeling displeasure, without being triggered by something. And in this way, all feeling to Kant really is a feeling of vitality. So, feeling pleasure of any sorts means feeling like your life force is sort of strengthened and extended. It means feeling more alive. While displeasure means feeling less alive, feeling like your life is somehow threatened or weakened or impeded. And therefore, Kant would also say that basically there are no different feelings. There is not a multitude of completely different feelings like happiness, sadness, love, hate, anger, fear, whatever. But rather, there is only one feeling, the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, which, as we now see, is really the feeling of your vitality. And there are only various degrees of that one feeling. There are only various ways of feeling that one feeling, various senses through which we can receive that one feeling. And therefore it can feel different, but really it's always the same in a way. There's only pleasure and displeasure. And what we call different kinds of pleasure is really just different degrees of pleasure. To Kant, one proof for that is that we can compare pleasures. Even seemingly very different pleasures, I can still compare, right? So I could say that a completely physical pleasure, like eating good food or having an orgasm, um, I can compare that to a more intellectual pleasure, like reading a book or enjoying visiting a museum. And I can put them into relation to each other. I can say that I enjoy one more than the other. I can say that I would pick one over the other, no matter which one. And Kant says that being able to compare them proves that in a way they are of the same kind. They are not completely different feelings, no matter how different they may seem to us, because then we couldn't compare them, right? I cannot compare, for example, weight and temperature. I cannot say that an object that is 100 kilos is more than an object that has 20 degrees Celsius, because 100 is more than 20. Because here, this statement would make no sense. Yes, 100 as a number is more than 20 as a number, but 100 kilos is not more than 100 degrees Celsius. I could only say that 100 kilos is more than 20 kilos. So one object is heavier than the other, or I could say that 20 degrees Celsius is less than 100 degrees. So one object is colder than the other. But I cannot compare completely different qualities. Well, since I can compare my feelings, and since I can, no matter which feeling I'm talking about, I can always say, I prefer this feeling to another feeling, or I like this feeling less than another feeling. Um, since I can say, I don't know, I enjoy the enjoyment I get out of spending Christmas amidst my family. I enjoy that more than riding a roller coaster. That to Kant proves that they are all various degrees on basically the same quality. And this quality is, once again, how alive I feel. And maybe it's fitting that Kant seems to, I say seems because he's not quite clear about that and he doesn't talk much about that, but he seems to locate the feeling in our vital sense. So in the lecture on sensuality, I talked about how to Kant, the sense, so that through which we are affected, that through which we receive sensations. The sense can be separated first into the inner sense, by which we are sensing what's happening in our own mind, so our feelings, our thoughts, and so on, and the outer sense. And the outer sense again can be separated into the 5 organ senses of tasting, smelling, hearing, seeing, and touching, which are located in specific organs. And then Kant also talks about a vital sense, which, according to him, is not located in a specific organ so much as rather in the body as a whole, or in the nervous system of the body. And this vital sense doesn't allow us to see or hear or touch or smell or taste, but Kant says that it is responsible for such things as sexual excitement, or the prickling you get on your back when you are fearful or whatever. Also sometimes warmth and cold. Kant also relates to this vital sense. So I think it is noticeable that this sense doesn't give us neutral sensations ever, but rather all the examples that Kant gives are feelings, are things that are to some degree pleasurable or not pleasurable. And once again, this is the vital sense. This is the sense that is not located in some organ, but rather that lets us sense our whole body and basically the state of our whole body. So even though Kant doesn't outright say it, it would make sense, I think, to say that to him the feeling of pleasure and displeasure is basically identical with this vital sense, at least when it comes to the outer sense, because Kant also says at some point that the feeling of pleasure and displeasure is basically the inner sense, because it is the inner sense through which we receive all our representations. But I don't think that's in contradiction, because after all, Kant says everything is received through the inner sense. Even what we receive through the outer sense still needs to pass through the inner sense, because all our feelings, all our sensations, all our thoughts, all our desires are, after all, experienced inside of us, in our psyche. So you could say that in general, the feeling is connected with the inner sense, but at least when it comes to all sorts of feelings of pleasure and displeasure that are not just mental, like let's say happiness or depression or whatever, or love or hate, but that are somehow connected to the body, at least when it comes to those, I think that Kant would locate them in the vital sense. And it seems that also the organ senses only cause us pleasure and displeasure insofar as they connect to that vital sense. So tasting and smelling are closer connected to our nervous system and to our vital sense, Kant would say, while seeing and hearing and touching are less connected to it. But they too, if they start affecting the vital sense, like I said, if something is too bright or too loud, then they too, but only then, cause displeasure or cause pleasure. But it is important that I clarify something here so as to prevent possible misunderstandings. I want to stress once again that according to Kant, the feeling of pleasure and displeasure doesn't teach me anything about an object. So he's not saying that the feeling of pleasure proves that my life forces are actually being improved, or that a feeling of displeasure proves that my life force is actually weakened. It just means that I feel like, subjectively feel like, it is strengthened or weakened. Because, of course, Kant is aware that I can feel pleasure even when something is bad for me, like from certain drugs, for example. Or that I can feel displeasure when something is actually good for me, like maybe I'm undergoing surgery to save my life because I have a life-threatening sickness. That surgery is therefore good for me and for my life. It's improving my life force overall, but still it will feel painful if I do it without narcotics. But here Kant would say we don't necessarily feel our life as a whole. We may feel certain parts and ignore other parts. And sometimes it may be that something improves or threatens a specific part of my vitality, but not the whole. Like, for example, if I drink alcohol, Sure, it in some way poisons my body, but and in that way it actually impedes my life. But in some way, at least it improves my life. Maybe it makes me loosen up in social situations, and maybe it is that feeling of improved sociality, so to say, um, which gives me a feeling of pleasure. And on the other hand, sure, the surgery overall saves my life, but still there is no doubt that that body part which is sliced open, um, its life is actually being attacked. And that is what I'm feeling when I'm feeling pain from that. Um, Kant says that even something that is good for me could possibly become painful if it becomes too much, because any improvement of my life force has to still keep a sort of balance with the whole of my life forces. I can't just improve one part um, beyond what the other parts can sort of take. If it gets improved too much, the pleasure turns into pain. I think that overall Kant is quite right in how he describes pleasure and displeasure. And he is here basically taking the first step towards development in philosophy uh, that happened after him in the 19th and 20th century. And that is a turn of philosophy, not everything that is called philosophy, but everything that should be taken seriously in philosophy in more recent time. Um, a turn of philosophy towards, well, a philosophy of vitality. A turn of philosophy, you could say, towards the body, towards um, grounding everything, grounding even the thinking in physiology. Thinkers that went in that direction would be most prominently Nietzsche, but also Wilhelm Reich or my own father. They all, in a way, had a philosophy, a physiological philosophy, a philosophy, once again, of vitality. And you could say that here in Kant, you have the first small steps in that direction, the first beginnings. And indeed, Kant is going in a similar direction as those later thinkers who then would go further and deeper in that direction. So he comes relatively close to what Nietzsche or Reich would also say about us either enjoying the expansion of our life and of our strengths, or feeling pain because we feel that our life is somehow impeded and somehow weakened. And I would say that this general feeling of vitality, and again, to Kant, all the different kinds of pleasure and of displeasure really come down to one general feeling of pleasure and displeasure, and to different degrees of that feeling. I would say that that feeling of vitality, so of pleasure, that is basically courage. While the feeling of my vitality being attacked and weakened, of me not having the strength to deal with life, that is basically fear. And here I'm quite in line with the thinkers I named, like Reich, basing his work on Freud, would say that you can sort of feel overwhelmed by life, threatened by life, unable to deal with life, then you will retract from life, and that is what happens in fear. And the opposite, he identified with lust, with pleasure, with sexuality in general, that is expanding, going out into the world because you feel the strength to do so, embracing life, getting into contact with life. And since it is the opposite of fear, it would basically mean courage, right? And Kant himself is not saying very much about fear and courage. What little he does say, I will address eventually when I get to Kant's concept of Aufklärung, because to him Aufklärung is based on courage. But he basically does say that courage is the feeling of your own strengths, of being able to deal with something, while fear would be a feeling of your own weakness, of a challenge overwhelming you, being too much for you, and therefore something you fear. And Kant himself might not have gone deeper here, and Kant himself might not have reflected on this further. But I think if we compare what he says about courage and fear with what he says about pleasure and displeasure, then it sounds quite similar, right? If courage means the feeling of my own strength to deal with something, and pleasure in general means feeling my own vitality, feeling my life force, feeling my strengths being, well, strengthened and expanded, then really courage should be the basic, the fundamental feeling of pleasure, of embracing life, while fear would be the basic feeling of running away from life, of being overwhelmed by life, of feeling displeasure, of feeling pain. And I mean, etymologically, the word courage comes from the Latin word for heart. This is also where the word core comes from. And so therefore, having courage would just mean having heart in general. And isn't the heart exactly the place where traditionally, just like we locate the thinking in the head, the feeling is located? So really, having courage means having feeling, having a good feeling, having pleasure, being able to embrace life because you feel your own vitality, you feel your own strength to go out into the world and to deal with life. But anyways, so far I talked about pleasure and displeasure in very general terms. Now, Kant actually says that human beings have a threefold nature. I will not go into that deeper here because in the future I want to get into that in its own lecture when I talk about Kant's anthropology. So here a general overview will be enough. Kant says that we are, on the one hand, sensual beings. We are basically animals. We have an animal nature. But then on the other hand, we are also intellectual beings. We are also spirits. We have a sort of spiritual nature. And then third, or rather second, because it's in between those other two, we have a combined animal, sensual, and spiritual, intellectual nature, because we are sensual beings with an intellect. We are intellectual animals, so to say. And if you accept the two premises Kant has here, that is, one, feeling pleasure is basically feeling an improvement of your life force, and feeling displeasure is feeling your life force being somehow lessened. And two, you as a human being have a threefold life. Then it follows from these two premises that we can expect three different types of pleasure or displeasure. And this is indeed what Kant teaches. He teaches that we have three different ways of, well, feeling pleasure and displeasure. First off, there is what he calls sense pleasure. And this type of pleasure he describes as a feeling of enjoyment, or delight, you could maybe also translate it. And the thing which gives us enjoyment or delight, that thing he calls the pleasurable. And of course, it follows what the opposite would be. It would be the displeasurable. And this is a sort of pleasure, this, well, delight or enjoyment that we feel through the sense, that is brought to us through our sensations. And then, second, there is what Kant would call aesthetical pleasure. And this type of pleasure he calls like. So, liking something. Liking something to Kant would not be the same as enjoying something or taking delight in something. But liking something describes aesthetical pleasure. And of course, aesthetical displeasure could then be described as dislike. And the object which brings us that pleasure is not called the pleasurable by Kant, but rather the beautiful and the sublime. And of course, we could also say that the opposite, so that which brings us aesthetical displeasure, that which we dislike, would then be the ugly. And whatever is the opposite of the sublime. Kant doesn't supply a word here, but maybe we could say it's the pathetic. And this is a sort of pleasure that doesn't come to us through the senses, but through our power of judgment, which is exactly why Kant deals with it in his critique of the power of judgment. The power of judgment in the case of the beautiful would be called the taste. And in the case of the sublime, there's not exactly such a proper name for it. Kant sometimes calls it just the feeling. So not the feeling in general, the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, but rather the feeling in a more aesthetical sense, just like the taste for the beautiful is the taste not for food, but the taste in a higher sense. And this is a sort of pleasure that is found in viewing, in intuition, not in the senses, but in viewing. And lastly, there is what Kant calls intellectual pleasure. And this type of pleasure he doesn't call delight or liking, but rather he calls it approval. So approving of something. And then, of course, intellectual displeasure could be disapproving of something. And the thing which causes that intellectual pleasure is not called the pleasurable or the pleasant by Kant. It's also not called the beautiful or the sublime, but rather it's called the good. What we judge to be good is that which we approve of, and what we judge to be bad is that which we disapprove of. And this intellectual pleasure does not come through the senses or through viewing, but rather it comes through a concept, and therefore through the intellect, since the intellect is the faculty of concepts. I want to address these types of pleasure and talk about them a bit more specifically. So first off, the sense pleasure. That is the delight we take in pleasant things like food or sex or whatever. Here we are passive, Kant would say. We can't really decide whether we want to feel pleasure or displeasure because it is caused by something outside of us, by some sort of object. Of course, I can actively try to get that object or to get rid of that object. In that I can be active, but that belongs to the desiring faculty. But if the object is there, like if I have food in my mouth, I will feel that taste, and I will either feel pleasure because it tastes good or displeasure because it's disgusting. Or if I have a knife that cuts me, then I will feel that pain, whether I want to or not. This pleasure is based on our sensuality. And as I explained in the lecture on sensuality and the supersensual, to Kant, sensuality is the faculty of receptiveness. So, sensual we are whenever we are receiving something, whenever we are receiving representations because an object somehow affects us. And that is what is happening here. We are passively being affected by some sort of object, and that either gives us a feeling of our animal nature being improved, being strengthened, or our animal nature, our body, our physiology being in one way or the other attacked and threatened, and therefore a feeling of pleasure or displeasure. And this sort of pleasure is something we have in common with other sensual beings, that is, with the animals. They also feel this sort of pleasure and displeasure, Kant would say. Now, of course, not necessarily in the exact same instances. Like we can have, because we have different bodies, a different physiology, we can maybe find pleasure or displeasure in different things. So Kant would say, for us, rotting flesh smells disgusting, but some animals, like the crows, they seem to like it. But the general feeling of receiving pleasure from objects, the general feeling of having this sense pleasure, this delight in pleasant things, that is something we do share with the animals. And this sort of pleasure, however, is something that, according to Kant, is a subject rather for empirical psychology or for the anthropologist. Transcendental philosophy doesn't really have much to say about it, because it is so entirely subjective, and it is such a particular, such a private thing. Because it's not just that we and other animal species take pleasure, take delight in different things, but even amongst human beings, two different human beings can take delight in different things. So if I'm heterosexual, I can find pleasure in sex with women, and another man who may be homosexual, he won't find delight in women. He will find delight in men. Or maybe some dish tastes good to me, and to another person it tastes bad. And Kant would say that it would be nonsense to try to have a discussion about that. Like, you can't really say, if someone doesn't like your favorite food, you can't really say that you are right and he is wrong. You can only say, okay, well, we have different tastes. Maybe your bodies are different. Maybe you have a different physiology. Maybe you have different needs, and therefore you experience pleasure or displeasure in different instances. Maybe it also has to do with what you're used to and how you were raised. But one way or another, we all take delight in different things, and there's never someone right and someone wrong. And we can't discuss this, we can't argue about this, and we can't convince anyone to change his mind. Like, if a certain food tastes bad to someone, it doesn't matter what sort of arguments I use, no argument will convince him that it actually tastes good. What I do want to say about this kind of pleasure is, however, that throughout the history of thinking, it was oftentimes rejected. Maybe less so nowadays, but for the longest time, it got rejected for alleged moral or religious reasons. The pleasure in good food would be maybe rejected as gluttony. The pleasure in sex would maybe be rejected as wanton lust. And again and again, you had certain thinkers or certain traditions that preached a sort of asceticism, that would teach that this sort of pleasure is somehow lesser, somehow more base than the other pleasures. That maybe you are allowed to take pleasure, intellectual pleasure, in what is good. Maybe not all would agree on that, but maybe you are also allowed to take aesthetical pleasure in what's beautiful. But you should not seek this bodily, this physical pleasure, this delight in what is pleasant. You should rather deny your body these pleasures. And about that, I just want to stress that this is not Kant's opinion. I find it important to stress that because there are these cliches, these wrong images about Kant, as if he himself had lived a very pleasureless life. I mean, sure, he was unmarried all life, but there are also these stories, these cliches about him that many people have heard, that allegedly he was living such a simple and pleasureless life, and he was super punctual, so that the people in Königsberg set their clocks after him, which is actually not true. It's just a story that always gets repeated. Kant did enjoy sense pleasures. He did enjoy what he considered good food, and he also enjoyed drinking wine to some degree, smoking the pipe. He enjoyed playing games. At least in his youth, he would play pool. So it's not like Kant was completely averse to such pleasures, and Kant would say that it is perfectly okay to take delight in food or to take delight in sex. Of course, always under the condition of morality, so only in ways that are sanctioned by the moral law. And to Kant, that means a bit more than just not using force, like just not raping when you want to have sex. No, sure, that also means that you must do it in a way that keeps your own dignity. So throwing your dignity away, to stuff yourself with food or to just sleep around, that would be something that is immoral according to Kant. I will talk more about that when I get to his moral philosophy. But it's not like you have to abstain completely, or you can't allow yourself these pleasures. He actually criticizes such a stance and calls it the virtue of monks, which to him is not a good thing, being a Protestant. However, while we should not fall into the extreme of this virtue of monks and be complete ascetics and completely deny ourselves these sense pleasures, it should be noted, on the other hand, that there are many people for whom there are only these sense pleasures. No aesthetical liking of the beautiful, no intellectual approval of the good, but just this sensual delight in the pleasant. And that is always a clear sign of an unaufclared person. That is always a clear sign of a lack both of taste and of morality. And I do want to point out that it is especially telling when such, well, here you can say base and primitive people, when they imagine perfect pleasure, perfect happiness, which they do imagine if they believe in some sort of heaven or in some sort of salvation. And I want to give two, on the surface, very different examples for this, but on a deeper level, they are exactly the same. On the one hand, I'm thinking of some boys here in my area where I live. There are lots and lots of Turkish and Arab immigrants, and some boys, some seventh graders, so about 12, 13, that I dealt with, who would consider themselves to be religious, to be Muslims, so their religion is basically limited to their parents forcing them to go to to the Quran school at the weekends, and to them believing that anyone who doesn't believe the same things they believe will eventually go to hell. And these boys, they would be quite shocked or quite irritated when I said that I wasn't waiting for heaven to come sometime after my death, but rather I already am in heaven right now. Now, what I said was actually not so unheard of in the Islamic tradition. What I said was actually not so shocking if you know anything about actual Islam. Like, if you know people like Rumi or Ibn Arabi, then maybe this should not surprise you so much. But of course, these boys, they are not Muslims. They are atheists who are basically LARPing at Muslims and as Muslims and not even realizing that they are LARPing. So they were irritated by that, and one of those boys actually said, and he probably thought he was being quite clever, he said, "If you are in heaven, where's your Lamborghini?" So that is what heaven means to these boys. You get a car. I also witnessed at some other point how one of those boys tried to convert one of his classmates who didn't identify as a Muslim. And what he told her was not that Islam is true or that Islam is good and it is morally good to follow God and it is what we should do. No, he didn't talk about such things because clearly he doesn't care about truth or goodness. What he talked about is he tried to win her over by speaking to her base desires. What he said was, if you convert, you will go to heaven and heaven will be great. And why will it be great? Well, once again, he said you can have every wish fulfilled. So you can drive a Lamborghini, of course. Or he said you can fly around like Superman. You can have superpowers in heaven. So that is the picture these boys have of a place of perfect happiness. The only type of pleasure they know is this sense pleasure, is driving around in a fast car or flying around like Superman. And of course, this makes you think of these infamous tales of getting 72 virgins in heaven. Now, these boys didn't talk about that. Maybe they were still a bit too young, so I would wager that at their age they were not too young to think about such things, but at least they were maybe too young to openly talk about it, to dare openly talk about it. But that is basically what heaven means to such people. It's a giant brothel and a racing track. You get sex, you get cars, that's heaven. Congratulations. Of course, to anyone who's a little more aufklärt and has a little more dignity, that's not heaven, that's actually hell. Like, I wouldn't want to go to such a place if it actually existed. But of course, from that perspective, it makes perfect sense that for them, what I said about already being in heaven sounds ridiculous. I don't have a bunch of Lamborghinis. I don't have 72 virgins. So clearly, I can't be in heaven. Now, of course, in actual religion, like if you go to actual religious thinkers, actual prophets and mystics and philosophers. Like in the Islamic traditions. Again, like Rumi or Ibn Arabi or Avicenna. That, of course, is not how they would envision heaven. They would envision heaven or paradise as uniting with God, as actually getting rid of yourself and of such base desires as wanting cars or wanting sex, and rising above that by realizing that that self is just an illusion, it's just a separation from God, and ending that separation, returning back to God. That would be paradise to them. And not just, of course, in the Islamic tradition, but in all religious traditions, basically. And of course, that is something which could be achieved in this life. You don't have to wait for dying to unite with God, because God is omnipresent. He's not just in heaven, he's here on earth, he's even in hell, he's everywhere. So you can be equally close to him or equally far from him everywhere. And of course, this primitive picture these boys have of heaven is completely un-Islamic, completely unreligious. It is quite pagan. It is actually shirk, as it is called in Islam. Shirk is idolatry, so worshipping something else besides God. Because if you think about it, if you are united with God, what else could you desire? How could there even be something else for you? How ridiculous to even think that he who has transcended his self, who has united with God, would desire something as like a car. That would basically mean saying, God is not enough for me, I need something else. So that would mean putting something else besides God. I mean, if you think about this, these boys don't care about God. They don't care about uniting with God. They care about driving their Lamborghini. And God is basically just meant to be their servant who provides that Lamborghini. They think, okay, I have to serve God for a few years, for like 80 years, and then for the rest of time, God will serve me. He will give me the cars, he will give me the woman. Actually, why doesn't God jerk me off right away? We could spare the middleman or the middlewoman, and God could just do it himself, because that's what I want from God, basically. And this, of course, again, is shirk. This means worshipping idols. The cars, the women, they are the idols put alongside God. And the Quran actually says as much. The Quran says there is no bigger sin than worshipping something besides God. But it also says that by that it doesn't just mean statues of other gods, but rather there is no bigger sin than putting your own desires besides God, worshipping them besides God. So basically, this hedonism, this materialism, is as far as you could be possibly from religion. It is basically atheism that believes in God. But the thing is that these boys, they are not just focused only on such basic sensual pleasures, but also they are immoral. Like, they are exactly the boys in their class who are causing the most trouble, who are disturbing class, who are bullying classmates. They are constantly being little shits. And they don't care about not being little shits. They don't care about becoming better people. Of course, they think it's not necessary to be better people, because what they think religion is basically a ticket to be an asshole and still get rewarded with heaven. Because I can be an asshole and I can always repent and pray and then be forgiven. Like, of course, if you ask them, they would say that Allah also wants them to be decent people, that insulting others, that gossiping about others is a sin, but they will still do it, and they will believe that these sins can be forgiven if they just pray. I mean, here in the local mosques, that's basically what they get taught. They get taught that praying is everything and every other sin can be forbidden if you pray. I mean, I have friends who basically have been taught by their Hodja in the mosque that you can even be a murderer and a rapist. Of course, you shouldn't be. God doesn't want that of you. But you can be a murderer and a rapist if you just pray. Because then even that can be forgiven. So praying is the most important thing, and all other sins can be forgiven if you just pray. Yeah, well, that's obviously a free ticket to be an asshole. And of course, it obviously has nothing to do with what the Quran actually says, because it stresses again and again that God loves those who act beautifully. Well, those boys don't act beautifully. Not a single second of the day. And their desires are also not beautiful. Their desires are primitive. And it's not just that they themselves are not moral people. They don't even believe that anyone can be moral. They don't believe that goodness exists. They believe that everyone is a selfish asshole. Like, when they found out that I graduated from high school with a 1.0, so that's basically in the German system, that's the best grade you can get. It's like a straight A. They asked, oh, why didn't you become a physician? But not because they thought being a physician is a good thing, because you help people, you possibly save people's lives. I mean, that would be a legitimate reason to become a physician. But no, because as a physician, you make good money. I mean, here in my area, that's basically what a lot of kids at school think grades are for. The better your grades, the better the job you will get and the more money you will make. And then you can buy a Lamborghini, or you can fly to Dubai or whatever. So everyone basically, if their grades allowed it, wants to become a physician, but not because they actually want to help people, but just because they think that's the best way to make money. And we also at some point had this discussion, what would you do if you suddenly were given $1 billion? And I said, I don't need $1 billion. Like, I would probably keep a little money, enough to live from it, so that I could focus completely on my philosophy, on my reading and writing, and the rest I would donate. And they didn't believe me. They said, oh yeah, that's what everyone says. Everyone says they would donate the money, but if you actually got the money, you wouldn't donate it. You would buy cars and whatever. It's always cars. It's always coming back to cars. I don't even have a driving license. Like, it's not necessary here in Berlin. We have public transport. I could not think of many things that would interest me less than buying a car. And I also don't get why a Lamborghini or a Porsche or whatever is better than, I don't know, a Volkswagen or Fiat or some other. I don't even know what cars there are. Like, does my dick grow bigger if I get a Lamborghini or what? I never figured out what the point is in having such a car. So no, I certainly would not buy cars if I got $1 billion. But my point is that these boys, they cannot even believe that other people are better, morally better than they are. They have the cynical opinion that everyone is as selfish and as hedonistic as they are. And when someone has that opinion, it's quite telling. It betrays their own personality. Because, I mean, how could you know how other people are? You can't look into other people's heart. You can't know if other people are selfish or if they are good. The only one you know is yourself. So if you find it so unimaginable that someone would be good and not selfish, then that can only be because you can't imagine yourself ever being not selfish. And of course, this too is a completely unreligious opinion because, of course, these boys don't think so far. But if they were correct, if really every human being without exception was a selfish hedonist, then that would include Prophet Muhammad. Then that would mean that his whole prophethood, spreading the true religion, was not done because he had an interest in spreading truth or in helping people. But it was only done out of self-interest. It was only done because he believed that it would get him into heaven and that he would be rewarded with, I don't know, cars or camels in his time, maybe. Of course, they would never outright say that about Muhammad. But if they wanted to be consistent, if you were thinking through what they are saying about humans, that basically is what they are saying. And that's quite blasphemous if you ask me. But anyways, these boys are just one example. My second example would be a prominent professor of physics in the US who is one of these silly transhumanists. Like he's writing best-selling books about that stuff. He's being taken seriously by those transhumanist tech fascists in the Silicon Valley. And this guy, of course, is an atheist. This guy, of course, doesn't have anything to do with those boys on the surface. But he does believe that in the near future, there will be a sort of super AI. And this super intelligence will transcend all human intelligence once computers are developed enough. And he believed that once that happens, we will all fuse with that AI. We will upload our brains into the cloud and we will become pure information, whatever that is supposed to mean. And of course, to anyone who is actually a thinking person, anyone who is minimally aufklärt, it is quite clear that in 500 years, people will look back and look at people such as this physics professor who actually believed that we will create such a super AI and then fuse with it. They will look at these people in much the same manner as we now look at alchemists from 500 years back who believed that they could turn lead into gold in a very near future. But I don't want to talk about the theoretical error in this guy's beliefs. I don't want to talk about how silly and superstitious his beliefs are. Just like I don't want to focus here on the theoretical error in these boys' so-called religion. But rather, the thing is that this professor claims that once our brains are in the cloud, we will live in a simulation like the Matrix, and the super AI will make us happy. It will simulate a perfect world for us. So it will basically serve the same function as God does to these boys, that is, being our servant who gets us off. And I think it says quite a lot if your God is basically nothing more than a supercomputer, if you have no higher concept of your God than that. And well, what is the perfect world and the perfect pleasure and happiness that this super AI will simulate for us? Well, of course, it comes down once again to some porn fantasy. This guy believes that we will basically have constant, never-ending orgasms. Once again, it's like these people, whenever they try to describe heaven, they end up describing hell. They can't help themselves. And he's saying that in the simulation, I will be able to have sex with amazingly attractive woman. In fact, he calculates it mathematically, and he says that the super AI will simulate a woman for me that will be 100,000 times as attractive as the most attractive real woman. Because apparently that is the limit. Like 100,001 times as attractive as the most attractive real woman, that would be not physically possible, not even for the super AI. That is mathematically proven, apparently. But I will get a woman that is exactly 100,000 times as attractive as the most attractive woman. Once again, this guy is not some nutcase in some basement. Yeah, this is a real professor. So he actually graduated from high school, from university. He actually made a PhD. He actually is a professor. He's actually teaching. There are people listening to him. In fact, when he puts out a video here on YouTube, or when he writes a book, he has a much larger audience than I do. So he is taken seriously. And the fact that such people are taken seriously instead of being, well, collectively ridiculed and shamed tells a lot about our time and age. But my point here is that, once again, this is so primitive, so hedonistic and sensual. Like, that is the only pleasure that apparently these people can imagine. And of course, these people too are without any morality. I mean, these transhumanists, they are all basically a modern brand of fascists. I don't really have to get into that. It should be known by now that this is basically a modern fascist tech cult they are part of, and it should be obvious that their whole vision of transcending humanity is born out of despising humanity. And what I want to stress is that on the surface, these people seem very different. I mean, on the one hand, you have some 12-year-old boys from immigrant families who struggle with school with simple math exams, and who consider themselves Muslims, who have some silly superstitious beliefs and some silly afterlife where they will get granted a Lamborghini. And on the other hand, you have this guy who's a celebrated physicist and who teaches at a US university and who is an atheist. And they have nothing in common, and they would never meet, never talk to each other. And yet still, if you strip all this superstructure away, and I mean this superstructure, these different beliefs, these different interests in life, they can mainly be explained by biographical coincidence, by where these people were born and in what circumstances, in what surroundings they grew up. But if you abstract from all of that, and if you just look at the posture of these people, their ethos, their way of dealing with life, you find they are the same unaufklärt people. They believe in silly nonsense, and they hope for a world where they will live in complete passivity, where they won't have to be active and do something anymore, but where they will basically get jerked off all day. And that is what they think of when they think of pleasure. But going back to Kant, I want to now skip the aesthetical pleasure for a moment and go right to the intellectual pleasure. What Kant says is that certain things may not cause delight, they may not be pleasant things, but they may be good things, and therefore our intellect, in thinking about them, may approve of them because it judges them to be good. And to Kant, there are two types of good and therefore two types of this intellectual pleasure. There is the mediate good and the immediate good. The immediate good would be the moral good, so that which is good in itself, and the mediate good would basically be the useful, so that which is good for something. So we take a certain intellectual pleasure, to start with that, in the useful, right? If I want something, let's say something simple, I want to cut bread, then I need a knife. And if I find that I have a knife which is sharp and cutting bread with it is very easy, then I will be happy about that. I will approve of that knife because it is useful for me. That means it is good. Not morally good, but good for something that is useful. And on the other hand, if I find that I have no knife at my disposal, or the knife I have is completely blunt and I can't properly cut with it, then that would probably cause some sort of displeasure. Not sensual displeasure. I would not feel a sort of pain in my body, but still, I would probably be annoyed at the blunt knife. I would disapprove of it. Or likewise, if we think about money, like let's say I do get that billion, and now I look at my bank account and I see that number, the billion, I would probably feel some sort of pleasure, but that would not be sensual pleasure, and it would not be caused by being sensually affected by that number. I mean, the pleasure comes not from seeing that number. Otherwise, I wouldn't care whether the number is on my bank account or whether I scribble it down on a piece of paper. If I just wanted to look at a one with lots of zeros behind it. No, the pleasure would be caused by my intellect reflecting about what that number means, and it would come from the concept of my intellect, from me understanding that this means I have a lot of money at my disposal that I can use for something. Of course, this mediate good is always only good for something, and that something will either be the immediate good, so a moral cause, or it will be once again my sensual pleasure, my delight. So basically, I am feeling a sort of pleasure, intellectual pleasure, when something is useful, because I think that it will either bring me sense pleasure or that it will bring me another sort of intellectual pleasure in what is morally good. And then, on the other hand, the immediate good, well, as I already said, that is what is morally good. So that is what I approve of, not because it is useful for reaching some goal I have, but because it is in itself a good thing. So I would, let's say, I would hear that there's peace in the world. There's now world peace. All the wars have been ended. All the parties that conflict have found a solution. That would make me happy. But this pleasure would obviously not be sense pleasure. I mean, essentially, this really couldn't affect me less, right? Maybe if I myself was in a war zone and there were bombs falling over my head, then I would also have sensual displeasure that would end if there was peace. But me being here where there's no war around, on a sensual level, nothing would change for me if there was world peace suddenly. But in my thinking about what that means, I would approve of it for moral reasons. And so I would, this intellectual approval would cause me another type of happiness. Now remember that all sorts of pleasure, according to Kant, are really me feeling my vitality being improved, my strength, my life force being improved. And well, the intellectual life is freedom. So intellectual pleasure I feel when freedom is improved. And on the other hand, intellectual displeasure I feel when freedom is impeded. So when it comes to the useful, something being useful gives me a certain kind of freedom, right? If I have that sharp knife, I have the freedom to cut. If my knife is blunt, my freedom is limited. I can't do what I would like to do. Likewise, if I had a billion, that would give me freedom to do a lot of things, to buy a lot of things. And on the other hand, if I'm poor and have no money, then I lack certain freedom. And of course, when it comes to the immediate, the moral good, this is not about the freedom to do something specific, to reach a specific goal that I might or might not have, but rather this is about freedom in general. If there was world peace, for example, that would mean people would be free from war. So this is what I take pleasure in here. And this type of pleasure requires understanding. It is a pleasure that comes from a concept, and it requires me having the right concept and understanding the right concept. Because whether I approve of something intellectually or not depends on what that something is, right? If a sick person is given certain pills, I cannot approve or disapprove of that without knowing whether those pills are medicine that will heal that person. Then I will approve of it for moral reasons. Or whether they are poison that will kill that person. Then I will disapprove of that for moral reasons. Same when it comes to the useful. Whether a thing is useful or not depends entirely on what it is meant for, right? So if I get a sort of pot and I find that it has holes at the bottom, I cannot really judge whether that's a good or a bad thing. It depends on what this pot is for. If it's meant for cooking, then those holes means it's not really useful because all the soup will run out. But if, on the other hand, it is meant as a flower pot, then actually those holes are a good thing. It means that the wetness will not stay in there and the roots of the flowers will not rot, but the wetness can run out. So here I need to have a concept of a thing in order to be pleased by it. When it comes to the delight and the pleasant, that is not the case. I can eat certain food and it can taste good to me without me knowing what I'm eating, without me knowing the ingredients. In fact, it's actually possible that if I knew what I was eating, that would cause me displeasure. Maybe I would then intellectually disapprove of that. Like if you were to eat something and it tasted good for you, but then someone would tell you, oh yeah, it's made out of maggots, maybe you would feel disgusted. Or if you were to eat it and someone were to tell you, oh yeah, that meat you're eating that's tasting so good to you, that's pork, and you are maybe someone who is Mohammedan or Muslim who doesn't eat pork for cult reasons, then you would maybe now spit it out and feel displeasure. Or let's say you're vegetarian and you thought that this was a vegetarian dish, and now someone tells you, oh no, what you just ate included meat. So here we can feel sense pleasure in something. It tastes good without knowing what it is, but intellectual displeasure. We can intellectually disapprove of it. And of course, it could also be the other way around, right? So if I'm sick and I'm giving a medicine and I'm told this medicine will heal me, but it tastes bad, then I will have a sensual displeasure in drinking that medicine, but intellectually I will approve of it and I will please that I was given something that possibly saves my life. And since this intellectual pleasure, unlike the sense pleasure, is based on concepts, we can also argue about it and we can convince people. Like I can, for example, prove to someone that a certain medicine is really helpful, that it really might save his life, and thereby I can make him get intellectual pleasure from that medicine, which otherwise he wouldn't have had. As I said before, when it comes to sense pleasure, that's not possible. I cannot argue with someone about how a dish tastes, and I cannot, using arguments, make him start liking that dish. And this sort of pleasure, this intellectual pleasure, just like we have the sense pleasure in common with animals, this is something we have in common with other intellectual beings, with other beings of reason, if there are such, like with the angels or with God even. They too would take pleasure, that is, they too would approve of something that they understand to be good. Either because it's useful, so it's good for something, or because it's simply morally good. Like, of course, in the case of God, he won't find intellectual pleasure in the useful, because nothing is useful to God. He's almighty. He doesn't need to use any tools to reach his goals. But he would at least find pleasure in what is morally good. He would approve of that. And this sort of pleasure is general. Like I said, the sense pleasure is particular. What tastes good to me might not taste good to someone else. But this intellectual pleasure must be the same for everyone. Now, of course, this depends on a condition. That is only if those people have the same goals. Like, let's say someone wants to commit a murder, and now he's given a poison which is both very deadly but also untraceable, so he wouldn't be caught. Then he will maybe find intellectual pleasure in that poison, not as something that is immediately good, because it's certainly not morally good, but as immediate good, as something useful for his goals. While on the other hand, if I'm against murdering people, I will actually disapprove of the existence of such a poison. But if I had the same goal as that person, if I too wanted to kill someone, then I too would take intellectual pleasure in that poison. So as long as two people have the same goal, they would have to approve of whatever is useful for that goal. And the same can be said about the intellectual pleasure in the immediate good, and that which is moral. That is universal. So all human beings, and even beyond that, even God, should take pleasure in that. Of course, it being universal, by that Kant does not mean that everyone does take pleasure in what is morally good, because, of course, evil people don't. But everyone should take pleasure in it. And if they were good, like if they were to have a good character and a good will, then they would need to approve of the same things. That is, of whatever is morally good. This intellectual pleasure, however, also doesn't really concern transcendental philosophy. And there also isn't much more to say about it. Because sure, I should want what is morally good, and if I want that, then I will take pleasure in it. But wanting it, or rather the fact that I ought to want it, that belongs not to the faculty of feeling, but to the desiring faculty. And I will talk about that when I get to Kant's moral philosophy. And on the other hand, as for what is useful, well, that really depends on what goals I take for myself, right? And finding out what is useful for whatever my goal may be, that is really something that I can use my theoretical reason, my theoretical intellect for. Like, that depends on understanding how the world works, understanding the laws of nature. If theoretically I understand that a certain object is useful for reaching a certain goal, and if I make that goal mine, then I will feel pleasure. But making that goal mine, or understanding that this object helps me towards that goal, that really doesn't have anything to do with the feeling of pleasure as such. So we can put that aside. And well, to conclude what was said so far, we would have two types of pleasure now, and of course also of corresponding displeasure. One sensual, one intellectual. One material, so a pleasure depending on how we are affected and what we are sensing, and one formal, a pleasure depending on our concept, on the formal way we think about something. One would be a passive kind of pleasure, like we can't help to feel pleasure or displeasure if that thing causing it is affecting us. And the other would be an active kind of pleasure, because here me feeling pleasure or displeasure really depends on, well, me, on whether I make something my goal or not, on whether I am a moral person or not. But here I purposefully left out or skipped over one type of pleasure, and that is the aesthetical pleasure, the liking of the beautiful and of the sublime. So now I want to focus on the beautiful for simplicity's sake, and also because Kant himself makes that his main focus. What type of pleasure is that? Because to be sure, it is a type of pleasure, right? We can agree on that much, that beauty exists, or rather, the judgment that things are beautiful exists, and people take a liking to the beautiful. People enjoy what they find beautiful. But what type of pleasure is it they are feeling there? And well, here traditionally there are basically two answers: the answer of the empiricists and the answer of the rationalists. The empiricists would claim that that is what empiricism always claims, that everything comes through the senses, that everything comes from experience. Just like in theoretical philosophy, and I talked about how Kant there deals with empiricism and rationalism in a previous lecture. Just like in theoretical philosophy, the empiricist says all our thoughts, all our concepts come from experience. We are basically born as a blank slate. The aesthetical empiricist would say that enjoying the beautiful is really just another type of delight in the pleasant. So it is something that comes through the senses. In the 18th century, empiricism was most prominent in Great Britain. And there you had aesthetical theories that basically explained the beautiful away as being a sort of sense pleasure. And to be sure, there does seem to be some truth in that, because yes, we do experience the beautiful through our senses, right? We must see it or hear it. But nevertheless, Kant disagrees with the empiricists. If the beautiful was just sense pleasure, if it was just delight in whatever is pleasant, then you would expect the animals to also appreciate beauty. But they don't. And we must not be fooled by animals being drawn to things that we find beautiful, like the song of certain birds, or like the feathers of the peacock that attract the female peacock, or like flowers with their many beautiful forms and colors that attract bees. Because all of that is not really about them being beautiful to these animals, but about them being pleasant to these animals, because it is always about either food or sex. And you don't really find animals appreciating something which cannot affect them in that sense, which cannot please them in that sense. You don't really find animals appreciating a beautiful sunset or a rainbow. And here I do want to note that nowadays it is the reigning ideology to say that humans are just animals and nothing else, that we are different from animals, maybe in degree, but not really in quality. In more recent years and decades, there have been lots of experiments and lots of discoveries when it comes to animal behavior. And we have indeed found that animals, at least certain animals, like some monkeys or rats or crows or dolphins, that they can be quite clever. And you often hear that they are smarter than human babies or toddlers of a few years. And to be sure, it is quite amazing and quite remarkable what some animals can do. And surely we now know that they can do much more than humans realized in Kant's day. But nevertheless, Kant, I think, even if he lived today, would still insist that animals are not just a bit less smart by degree, but rather their cleverness is completely different from our actual reason and intellectuality. And nowadays, humans being basically just animals, which, to be clear, is true on a biological level, and Kant too would say that biologically, when it comes to just our bodies, yes, we are animals, but he would insist that reason goes beyond biology, as irrational as that may sound to the arationalists. Note the irony. Because this ideology that is reigning now, it is mainly supported by arationalists, that is, by people who don't, even if they may say otherwise, who don't really believe in reason. It is supported by materialists, by, well, essentially nihilists, who want to deny that human beings are anything, that they have any importance or value. Of course, it is also a belief that is supported by other groups for slightly different reasons. Like there are many, let's say, nice but misguided people, many animal activists who think that by emphasizing how similar humans and animals are, we would have more compassion for animals and treat them better because we would consider them our equals. I will, by the way, when I get to Kant's moral philosophy, I will also get to what he says about the treatment of animals, and you will hopefully realize that it is perfectly possible to treat animals right out of moral reasons without considering them your equals. I mean, we don't just have to treat our equals right, we have to treat everyone and everything right. But anyways, I very consciously call this an ideology because it's just that. It's treated as if it was very rational and scientific and unprejudiced and quite the opposite. Everyone disagreeing with that, everyone claiming that humans are in any way special was ideological and prejudiced. But really, it is just an ideology. It's not something that is or even could be scientifically proven. And such materialists who claim similarity between animals and humans, they are the ones who would tend to say, well, all pleasure is sense pleasure. But the thing is, they would have a hard time really explaining the beautiful. I think that this is exactly one of the proofs. It's not the only one, not even the best one, but it is one of the proofs, or at least the indicators, that there is a more to humanity, which cannot be found in animals. Because again, animals don't seem to appreciate beauty. And of course, those materialists, they don't have intellectual honesty. So they would try what ideologues always do when confronted with something that doesn't fit their ideology. They would try to debate it away. And that is something that can always be done. So these materialists, they will claim that the beautiful is just a sort of sense pleasure. And also when it comes to morality, they will also claim that morality is just another form of selfishness. Like they will claim that it can be explained through evolution, that we act moral to fit into the group and get support of the group, or we act moral to ensure the success of our genes. So parents might sacrifice themselves for their children, but that's still a sort of selfishness extending beyond the self. So they will claim such things. But if they had intellectual honesty, they would then at least say there is no beauty and there is no morality. You cannot say beauty and morality can be reduced to the sense pleasure, because why even talk about them then? You don't need three different words if it's only one and the same thing. You only need different words if you're talking about different things. So it is intellectually dishonest to say beauty or morality are part of the sense pleasure. It would be more honest to say what you think is beautiful or moral is part of that sense pleasure, but it actually isn't beautiful or moral. There is no such thing as beauty or morality. Because you can't just change the meaning of those words to fit you. I mean, I could also say unicorns exist. A rhino is a unicorn. Yes, if I change the definition of what unicorn means, I can say that. But actually, what the word unicorn means is something which doesn't exist. And it is more intellectually honest to just admit, no, unicorns don't exist. We can imagine them. And likewise, the materialist should say, maybe we can imagine something as morality or beauty, but it doesn't actually exist. But anyways, so Kant disagrees with empiricism. And the other position would be rationalism. And as always, rationalism means that something is not based entirely on experience, but it is based on our reason. It is based on thinking. It comes out of our own thinking. And that is what Kant is saying. He says that finding something beautiful is based on a sort of judgment. And therefore, it is based in some way on our thinking faculty. And therefore, a creature which doesn't think, which is purely essential, like the animals, won't know about beauty. But that is aesthetic rationalism only in the broadest sense, saying that beauty somehow comes out of thinking. But if we now ask how exactly does this work, then Well, the rationalism that was prominent in 18th century Germany, the rationalism that Kant would call dogmatic rationalism, or that you could call objective rationalism, the rationalism of the Leibniz-Wolffian school. And here the most prominent or most important figure would be Baumgarten, who was the student and the successor of Wolff in the professorship in Halle, and who was also important and influential on Kant. These objective or dogmatic rationalists would claim that what we see comes out of our thinking, but only in the sense that our thinking finds some sort of truth that is in the things themselves, so that is outside of our thinking. We just get to that truth not through the senses, but through the intellect, but it is still a truth that is independent of us. So this objective rationalism would claim that things really are beautiful, objectively beautiful, and we just, through our intellect, realize that they are beautiful. And the explanation given was that the beautiful thing is the perfect thing. And when we, with our intellect, examine a thing and find that it is perfect, then we take a liking to it. And that is what we call beautiful. And Kant disagreed with that explanation too, like probably most people would nowadays, because rationalism has completely fallen out of fashion. I mean, we live in a very empiricist time nowadays. He disagrees with that because, for one, he says perfect is a relative term. So we can't say that something is absolutely perfect. We can only say that it is perfect for something. And that means that whether something is perfect or not can only be judged if we have a concept of it. So I can say something is a perfect car. So as a car, it is perfect. But I can only judge it to be a perfect car if I know what a car is and what a car is supposed to be. Like if a person from Kant's age was walked into our time and was shown a car, he would probably think that it's some weird kind of cart. And he would probably not find it perfect. He would probably ask, oh, but where would you fasten the horses? There's nothing to fasten the horses to. And anyways, this thing is way too big and way too heavy. How many horses do you want to use to draw this? And also, where's the horse driver supposed to sit? This is a very imperfect cart. So we can only judge it to be a perfect car if we know what a car is. Right? Or think of the example I gave a bit earlier about the pot. If the pot has holes in the bottom, I don't know if that makes it perfect or imperfect, unless I know whether it's meant as a pot for plants or whether it is meant for cooking. So that would mean that if beauty was just us recognizing that something is perfect, then it would mean that we would need a concept of things before we find them beautiful. And that is not the case, Kant points out. Like, I can find a flower beautiful without knowing that the blossom is basically the sexual organ of that flower. But I would need to know that in order to judge whether it's perfect or not, right? I mean, I could then, if I know what its purpose is, then I could judge whether with its color and with its smell, it can attract insects, or maybe it can't attract them. Or I could judge if it is shaped in a way that insects can easily get inside to spread the pollen, or if it is shaped in a way that prevents the insects from getting inside. And so I could now, when I know what the blossom is for, Now I could judge if it's a perfect blossom or not. But that has nothing to do with finding it beautiful or finding it ugly. And also, if that was the case, if beauty was about perfection and therefore based on a concept, then it would be possible to make someone find something beautiful through an argument. Then I could prove that something is beautiful by giving someone the right concept, by explaining to someone that this is a perfect thing. But that is not the case, Kant says. We cannot convince someone to find something beautiful which to him simply isn't beautiful. So objective or dogmatic rationalism is obviously also wrong. And here Kant does what he always does. He employs his sympathetic method, about which I talked in its own lecture. The method that is based on the belief that in such a dispute, no side is completely wrong. Both sides will have at least a partial truth. And so this method is about finding the partial truth, getting rid of the partial error, and combining both of the partial truths into a third, into an improved middle position. And whenever Kant is faced with this conflict between empiricism and dogmatic objective rationalism, so whether it is in theoretical philosophy, and I already talked about that there in the lecture on sensuality and in the lecture on empiricism and rationalism, or whether it's in his moral philosophy or his philosophy of religion, or whether it is here in the aesthetical philosophy, whenever Kant is faced with this conflict, employing his sympathetic method, he arrives at a subjective, at a critical rationalism. So he disagrees with the empiricists always. He says, no, not everything comes from experience. Something comes from our intellect, and in that sense, he's a rationalist. But he is saying our intellect does not reach the things in itself, as dogmaticism claims, and therefore our intellect cannot make objective statements about the actual objects, but rather his critical rationalism says that our intellect can make subjective statements that are true for us as human beings. And that's what he says here when it comes to beauty too. That yes, finding something beautiful is not just because it is pleasant to my senses. It does depend on a certain judgment of the intellect, but that judgment is not about the thing in itself, and it is not a judgment that says that that thing is objectively perfect, but rather it is a subjective judgment about how that thing is for me. I find it beautiful if it is perfect for me, perfect for my power of imagination and my intellect. What exactly that means, I will get into in the next lecture when I talk about the beautiful. But that is Kant's basic position here. And so his great accomplishment in this part of philosophy is, well, realizing that there even is such a thing as the beautiful. Because if you think about it, both of the other positions, empiricism and objective rationalism, basically deny the existence of the beautiful. They basically reduce the beautiful to something else, to either sense pleasure or intellectual pleasure. While Kant says, no, it is a third, or rather a second, a middle type of pleasure that requires sensuality. I mean, we find things beautiful that we sense somehow, not mere concepts that we think, but that also requires intellectuality, because we find them beautiful not by the way they affect our senses, but by the way our power of judgment reflects about them. And that is his great accomplishment, realizing and also proving that the beautiful is really its own type of thing and comes with its own type of pleasure it causes. And that would mean, to conclude this lecture, that we have three types of pleasure. And if you think about Kant's theoretical philosophy and what he says about cognition, about which I gave many, many lectures, then you can find that his theories are closely connected. They are part of one and the same system. Because Kant says cognition, or rather experience, has three parts. One, two of them being sensual, one of them being intellectual. The first part is the sensation, which we receive through the senses. The second part is the two forms of viewing, that is time and space, which are not things that we sense, but rather all our sensations happen in time and space. We perceive them in time and space, and we can't help doing that because they are our forms of viewing everything. I talked about these two, about the sensations and about the forms of viewing, in my lecture on sensuality. And with that, I would have a perception. Sensations that I'm conscious of, that I am sensing in time and space, that is what a perception is to Kant. But then a third part, I need a concept. And I talked about that in my lecture on what is the intellect, because the intellect is the faculty of the concepts. I need a concept to understand what I am perceiving here, to understand what that object is I'm perceiving. And I need this concept also to connect my various perceptions into one system of experiences. I talked about that in my lecture on what is experience. And well, if you compare these three, let's say, steps in experience, these three parts of our experience, with the three kinds of pleasure, then it becomes quite apparent that they map onto each other. So we have the sensations, and I can find my sensations pleasurable. That would be the sense pleasure. That would be the delight in the pleasant things. And then I have my forms of viewing, time and space. And I can find something pleasurable simply in the form it has. And that would be the beautiful, or also the sublime. So a pleasure, a liking I take to something, that is based on the way I view it, on the intuition I have of it. And lastly, I can understand things by having concepts of those things. And likewise, I can have intellectual pleasure by approving of something according to the concept I have of that thing. And that concept saying that that thing is good, either in the sense of being useful or in the sense of being morally good. So these would be the three types of pleasure to Kant. And it should also be obvious that within his system there can't be another type of pleasure, because there is no other element in our experience from which this pleasure could spring from. So I will, as a last point, I will mention that to Kant all pleasure is in the body. He says that a few times, that all pleasure is, as pleasure, sensual. So when he talks about other kinds of pleasure, that relates to where they originate from. So intellectual pleasure means that the pleasure is caused by the intellect, but the pleasure itself is not in the intellect. It's not felt by the intellect. but rather feeling pleasure is always something that happens in the body, Kant says. Now, that may be a bit strange or contradictory if you think about it, because Kant claims that a pure intellectual being like God can also experience at least intellectual pleasure. How is that possible if all pleasure is in the body and God doesn't have a body? But to that, we can probably give two answers. For one, maybe Kant means to say that only for us as human beings, pleasure is always in the body or is always accompanied by something happening in the body. I mean, the same could be said about thinking. And I discussed that a bit in my lecture on what Kant has to say about the soul. He would also say that for us, thinking is always accompanied by something happening in the body. There's always something going on in my brain when I think, but that doesn't mean to Kant that it is impossible for a pure spirit to exist, which is just thinking without having a body or a brain. The same could maybe be said about pleasure. But you could also say that, well, maybe not just for us humans, but for any being, pleasure depends on a body. And in fact, Fichte would go on to show that any limited being must have some sort of sensuality and therefore some sort of body. So even if there are beings on a higher plane like angels, they still need to have some sort of body. Maybe it's a more ethereal body made out of a more light substance than our matter, but still it would have to be some sort of body. And therefore, you could say that all pleasure depends on a body. What about God then, who clearly doesn't have a body? Well, in a way, God doesn't have pleasure, not even intellectual pleasure. I will get more into that when I get to Kant's philosophy of religion. But basically, Kant says we cannot know God. We cannot know his inner nature. We can only speak about him by analogy. So when we say that God wants something, well, we want things. We have a will. And we cannot help but thinking of God in the same terms. But that does not mean that what we call God's will is anything like our human will. It's just that we can only imagine it as a will. And the same is true when we talk about God's pleasure, that is about God's felicity and blessedness. It is just an analogy. We cannot imagine that felicity in any other way, but imagine it as pure and eternal and unlimited bliss. But that does not mean that for God himself, in his inner nature, it is anything like the sort of pleasure which we have. So you could say that indeed all sort of pleasure requires a body, but still that doesn't mean that it necessarily comes out of that body or that body's senses being affected by an object. There can also be two forms of higher pleasure. One which is still sensual pleasure but not sense pleasure, which comes from the way we view things and reflect about what we are viewing, and one which is intellectual pleasure, which comes from the concepts our intellect makes of things. And it is that middle pleasure, that aesthetical pleasure, that pleasure we take in the beautiful and the sublime, which Kant deals with in his critique of the power of judgment, and which I want to deal with in the upcoming lectures in the next weeks. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.